This is House Planning Help, episode 269. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up today, Chris Parsons returns to the podcast. It's an episode on my own build as we look at the snagging and also celebrate. I've been in the house for a year. Can you believe that? Now, if you had to pin me down on one thing where you're going to learn the most about building a house, what would I suggest to you? If it was only one thing, probably it'd be walking around a construction site and just asking questions, and being able to do that lots of times obviously would help you. But then after that, I'd say it's going to the finished houses and certainly meeting people who've been there and done it, and also perhaps the professionals behind the builds. So there's a great opportunity that happens twice a year. It's the Passive House Open Days, and there's one coming up now in November. I'm quite excited because this is my first time too of actually hosting. We're opening the doors of the house for the Passive House Open Days. Hoping it won't be the last as well. So it's your opportunity to come and ask the questions that you want to ask. Maybe it's just to feel what it's like. You know, there is nothing like that first time when you come into the warm house in the middle of winter and go over to the radiator and think, this radiator actually isn't on. It's a good party trick. It's magic. It reminds me a little bit of the first time I saw an iPhone and just thought, wow, you've got internet on your phone. It was just, wow, that's amazing. And then before you know it, you just forget it's just normal, isn't it? So that's what's coming up. We'll put a link in the show notes if you haven't been to them before. I'd thoroughly recommend even perhaps going and checking out a couple of houses over the weekend, because it will be well worth your while. And I don't think you can ever overdo the number of site visits that you take part in your research. Well, perhaps you can overdo it, but you'd have to be really going for years and years on them. When you move into your new house, hopefully you get a lovely moment where everything is all sparkly and new. It's like buying a new car and you just want to preserve it that way. Right, we're locking the doors. It's going to be a museum for the next few years. And unfortunately, even if you do tiptoe around your property, issues will crop up. And that's what we're talking about today. Cracks in particular. Why does that happen? We're going to look into it. It's called snagging. So we're going to find out from Chris what that's all about, including a few examples from my own project and things that have cropped up over the year. First, though, some big news for Chris. He's now retired. So I started by saying, congratulations.
Thank you very much. Yep, and really enjoying that.
How has it been to close down an architecture firm? And I know you're not quite there yet anyway.
Yeah, slightly more problematic than I probably envisaged. We have a number of projects that are still running on, some just through the planning process and some on site. And I think what I didn't realise was I've got no one left to do any of the work. So if a drawing needs amending, it's down to me. But I've enjoyed that aspect as well, getting back to doing what I did when I first started.
And is it a case of once you close the office, everyone goes at the same time, or have you been able to gradually reduce staff?
No, we selected a kind of an exit day, really, and so everybody went on the same day. A little bit emotional, obviously, tidying up and clearing up the office, and we had a few drinks the day before, so all good. Everyone's gone on to new positions, and everyone seems to be pretty busy. Some went self-employed, some have gone to work for another practice.
It may be a little too early for this, but what will you miss?
What will I miss? Some clients, Ben. No, seriously, what will I miss? I think the day-to-day cut and thrust of both business and the construction industry, I always enjoyed it. Never had a day when I thought this isn't what I want to do. So I might miss that a little bit, but I've got some new challenges, obviously. So looking forward to getting stuck into some of those.
And what are you going to do with yourself now?
So we want to do a bit more travel. I enjoy cycling. I took up cycling a few years ago, and I spend a lot of time now out on the bike, so enjoying that. I'm doing a little project in my village to improve the village hall, trying to get some grant funding for that. And I've taken up a board position for a housing association, which is also obviously very interesting.
Yeah, that's the thing. You never end up doing nothing when you retire. It's just an opportunity to change a little bit and have a more relaxed, hopefully-ish life.
Somebody asked me if I was going to go for a pipe and slippers retirement, and it's seriously not me.
Yeah, I don't think it would ever be me either. So this is a good opportunity. It's somehow been a year since I moved into the house. Is it looking different?
Well, obviously it's looking different because it's now a home rather than a house. Obviously, when we did the handover, it was all finished and, nicely finished, but it's still a house at that stage. And it's really nice to come back and see how people have settled into it, how they're using it, how they're enjoying it. So that's the main difference for me. I'm now in someone's home rather than the product of what we do for a living.
I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about the year, not that a massive amount has come up, and also the snagging, which is why you're here today. And let's start with that. So what is snagging?
So the build contract includes a rectification period, in your case 12 months, whereby any defects of materials or workmanship that crop up in that time, the contractor will come back and put right. So today's process is really to try to determine what those defects are, put them on a list and send them through to the contractor and ask him if he would come back and put those right. You kept a financial retention on him as part of the contract to make sure he does that. And once he's rectified all those defects, then I will issue a certificate to that effect and you have to pay some more money.
Yeah, our last bill. Looking forward to finishing that off. And that has been one great thing. I don't know whether it's like this all the time, but with snagging and little things that come up, it's made so much easier if it's dealt with quickly, and Mark's done that.
Well, that's good to hear. What we normally say about defects when they occur is if we can leave them until the end of the rectification period, that obviously makes most sense. But there will always be defects that occur that actually prevent you enjoying your property. And if that's the case, then he should come back in a reasonable amount of time, and obviously has done so, to make sure that he puts them right. So that's just typical of a good contractor relationship.
Are these defects all things that as a client I should be able to spot?
Not necessarily. One of the reasons why I'm here today, obviously, is to kind of cast my professional eye over, and if I see something that I think is a defect that you may not have noticed, that's one of the reasons for me coming. But in general, you've lived in and used a house for 12 months, so those little niggles that I wouldn't see, you will have done. So I always ask, as I have done today, for you to prepare your own list so that I can look at those and determine whether they're really defects, and also so that I've got the basis then of what I might add to give a list through to the contractor.
And are there any themes with, say, timber frame versus masonry?
I would suggest that in terms of defects, the difference in those two themes is going to be probably based around shrinkage and how that occurs. And shrinkage is quite an interesting one because it's not technically a defect. You may have noticed I carefully spoke about a defect of materials and workmanship. And some natural materials and any plastering type process that involves putting in a lot of moisture will suffer from some shrinkage. Not contractually a defect, but most contractors will come and put those right at the same time.
Well, that was something that's happened quite recently. We believe that the shower tray dropped. So, in effect, we got a leak on the kitchen ceiling, not a big one, but the plumber was saying that it only takes a very, very tiny amount. And as we looked at it, you could see that it had just dropped off, so the sealant needed replacing. So at the moment we're hoping that that's all it is. And is that a case that now that it's settled, it's unlikely to cause us problems again, or should we keep an eye on that every year?
I think you should always keep an eye on silicone sealants around things like shower trays, baths, sinks, etc., because they do tend over time to, whether it's shrinkage or not, I'm not 100% sure, but I often find that after 5 or 6 years, they get tired anyway and might want replacing. They're intended to be a flexible seal to accommodate some movement, but there will always be some movement. I mean, to start with, we've got the possibility of some settlement because we put a huge, heavy, great house on top of the land. That's going to involve a little bit of movement. And then there's shrinkage in the components that we use. So actually here we used a space joist where I wouldn't expect necessarily a floor to move that much. But we're talking about millimetres that would create that gap in your silicone seal around your shower tray. So not an unusual thing for me to see at this stage.
And these cracks that we've talked about, is it just a case of filling them? What is the difference between a crack that will just need a bit of painting over and something that will cause us a lot of distress?
Well, I guess in each case I've got to have a look at it and try to determine what I think the cause might be. From what I've seen from a quick cursory glance around, we've just got the very typical, in fact, not very many cracks for a property of this age, just some minor shrinkage cracks. We've got an interesting one around your window reveals where the angle bead has moved, and obviously we will deal with that. And yes, generally it's a fill and redecorate. The question is always how much redecoration have you got to do to make sure you can't see the crack.
And you can't just redecorate, can you, in that one little area? Never quite works like that.
It never quite works. So it's nearly always, do we need to do the whole wall? And, what's the knock-on effect of that? Might make an interesting podcast with your contractor when he comes back.
Is that some element of snagging as well, that there are certain things that I know I heard Kay chatting to you just now about how we've got a bit of a sound connection in the MVHR from the ensuite down into the kitchen. And as I see it, that's something to do with the silencer and would involve ripping out the bathroom. I could be completely wrong here, but do you just live with some stuff? It doesn't really cause us any grief at all. We just know about it.
I need to look at exactly what was specified in terms of whether there's any missing sound attenuation. I don't think that there is, because I think we would have spotted that during the construction. I think it might just be, it was probably on the extract from your kitchen and the extract from your ensuite are probably on the same line. So there will be a little bit of noise transfer between the two. But I need to look at the drawings and actually to try to understand why it's happening.
And I think as well, when I was chatting to one of the guys at Green Building Store who supplied it and probably checked all the designs as well, they're saying it was the beginning of the branch as well. It's probably the shortest run, all of those sorts of things. But I'll be interested to see what comes out of that. Just reflecting now on our year here, it's a passive house and very little has happened there. But overheating is something that becomes a lot more apparent when you come into hot weather, and particularly hot nights. So we had a couple of days where I think on one day, this was literally only for 2 hours, we went to 28 degrees. Now, in passive house terms, that's barely scraping into the overheating. But do you ever retrofit in any shading solutions? I'm not even thinking for all the windows, but something temporary. You quite often see these sails that some architects like and so forth.
Yeah, people, I think, need to understand that the biggest issue that we have, is that right to say it, the biggest issue? Certainly a major issue that designers need to consider when designing passive house, or indeed any low energy housing, is overheating. And it's kind of a thing that people didn't really think about that much until recently. I'm not talking about recently in passive house terms, but recently in housing design, because the general problem has always been how do we keep a house warm enough? But now, of course, we've solved that. We can solve that very easily. And the next problem is, are we keeping them too warm? So our designs, and passive house in particular, requires that we look very closely at overheating and what we can do about it. So external shading is always considered as part of the design to try to avoid it. I've never had to retrofit anything. Maybe that's because I've never had anything that's particularly overheated. But I can see that it could be necessary if somebody has a design that is not working in terms of reducing overheating.
But it's more, I think, control. You can live through these temperatures. I bet other people are far worse off in their house. I'm getting nitpicking here.
Well, I think I agree with you. I don't live in a passive house. I wish I did. And we did have a bit of a mini heat wave in the summer, which is probably when you went to 28 degrees. And my house was unbearable. And I was using all the cooling techniques that you should use for a passive house, but it still got to 30, 31 degrees for reasonable long periods of time. So
I'm thinking about George on Twitter who will tweet away, oh, look, it's 21 when it's 35 outside. I think, how have you controlled it to that degree?
Well, obviously, each house is individual, so some are easier to keep cool than others, and obviously the design will have an impact on that. But there are some design constraints that you can't overcome. Orientation of your house, for example, we were stuck with because of the site constraints. So then you just try to mitigate what will likely cause overheating. Control, you're absolutely right. People do need to learn to cool their house down. And we've probably talked about, how you should do that, particularly allowing cool air through the house overnight. Trying to open windows both sides of the house to allow that cool air to get through. Not so easy in your house, for example, because you don't have so many windows on the other side, if you want, on the back of the house for overlooking reasons. So, each house has its constraints, but there are techniques to try to keep your house cool in those periods. Not everybody understands them. It's not so bad for you. You're an interested occupier. But in the social housing arena, for example, trying to educate tenants that this is something they need to do is more of a challenge for the industry. And I think there's still work to be done.
And Mark Brinkley, another example that I saw in that heatwave. Admittedly, this was, I think, the hottest day the UK has ever had, going to 38. And his nighttime temperature was 31. But having visited his house, I think perhaps one of the other things is that when you have less space upstairs and more downstairs, is that a contributing factor?
Yeah, as I said, each house is individual, and it depends on the individual design. I think Mark's house is in Cambridge, isn't it? And obviously cities are generally warmer than rural areas, for example. So, his external temperature might have been higher than yours. There's so many individual things that can affect overheating, it's really difficult to comment. But I think the general point is, as designers, we need to be looking carefully to try to make sure that our houses can stay cool, because we're going to get more and more of those heat waves, and we need to understand that. We need to make sure that people know how to use their houses, but most of all, we need to make sure designers know what they're doing. And I'm not convinced, this is not true of the passive house fraternity, but I'm not convinced that many of our house designers fully appreciate that problem.
Yeah, and I just brought this up because, as I say, nothing much has happened over the course of the year. The biggest point on snagging was actually to do with the windows, and this was a fault at the supplier end that, as far as I'm concerned, was made easier with the way that they dealt with it. So there was a defect in all of the windows. Maybe you can have a more technical description of that. But it was quite a hard one for me to know what to do, because I don't think those windows were recycled. So effectively, I've got those windows replaced, and I didn't realise that the process of replacing the glass was, it's quite an extreme process. Nothing was pristine after that. So
okay.
I don't know. I thought I should bring that up to make people aware that there are bigger things, but it was dealt with very well, and I've certainly no grumbles with it. But from an environmental point of view, I think, oh goodness, could have done without that.
Well, I think it's good to hear that it was dealt with very well. I mean, I remember seeing the images of this mark that was inside the sealed unit, which had to be a manufacturing fault. And obviously, it's necessary for the manufacturers to know that they've got a defect in their production process, and for them to make sure that they rectify that within their production facility so that they don't get it again. So going back to the manufacturer and asking them to put it right is what we have to do. Yes, there's an environmental cost, I'm sure, and there's a cost because there's disruption to you living in your house. And I know that they were careful, but there may have been some decorative issues that followed, all of which all come back to the defect, and again, one of the reasons why we've got that rectification period in the contract. So yeah, it's inconvenient. All defects are inconvenient, but I don't know anyone who can build absolutely perfectly spot on day one.
Yeah, I don't think we're complaining too much. But is there a line then between snagging and actually this is upkeep of the house? Do you ever have that?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So this comes down to what we call client management. So I might see a defect, or one that you may have put down as a defect, which I don't believe is a contractual defect in terms.
I do have a couple, 2 children.
Yes, exactly.
They create many defects in the house.
So this, I have to be a bit of a politician sometimes at this stage, because you might regard, that's a defect, and I think, no, it's just wear and tear, I'm afraid. Most clients are understandable about that. So, but that's part of my role now, to try to determine, is that a contractual defect? Can I really ask the contractor to come back and put that right? Will he likely come back and say, well, no, that's wear and tear? So there's a little bit of adjudication almost in terms of putting the list together. Doesn't happen very often, because generally contractors want to maintain their reputation. So and if there's a good relationship, they will come back and probably go a little bit further than the contractor would require, just for the sake of a good relationship and a good reputation. But I don't want to rely on that, so I need to be fair in the list that I produce, and then I leave those other matters to the contractor to resolve as he sees fit.
As I've had a look at this list again today, I mean, I haven't added it up, but it's probably 15 things. So what is the difference between this and a major house builder who sometimes you hear these stories of ridiculous numbers on there, both on delivery and sometimes down the line?
Well, thankfully, I don't do too many rectifications for major house builders, but I've heard the same stories as yourself. I think in a lot of cases, the stories that you hear are more about the building not having been constructed properly in the first place rather than defects occurring. I think their construction methods are generally pretty good at removing those defects that occur during that rectification period, but I do think that some of their construction processes in the first instance are contributory to that reputation that we all know about.
So is there anything else that we need to know about snagging, or just that it is part of the process, and once these things are dealt with, what happens next?
Yeah, I suppose that's the point, really, what happens next, because you might still get some shrinkage and some movement, but I'm afraid that's no longer down to the contractor. You might get other defects which occur, which we would call latent defects. So that might be a defect of materials or workmanship that doesn't occur in that first 12 months. It might not occur for 5 years, for example. It doesn't mean to say that the contractor doesn't have some responsibility to come back and put it right. So although we sign off to say, yes, that's the end of the defects rectification period, the contractor is still liable for latent defects. There's a technical legal limit to it, but basically it's to the point at which it should reasonably have been discovered. So pity the poor contractor, because he never really fully walks away from something. If he's built something wrong, something bad, then there's still recourse to go back to him should that occur and be discovered later.
And that's another thing that's very nice about this kind of project is we do maintain that relationship. He knows how he's built the house. You are retiring now, so say, for example, we want to make some changes. We've thought about, we should have put another tap on the other side of the house. Now that, I don't know whether that be simple under normal circumstances. I guess it depends where you've located the water main, but am I right in saying it's inside the envelope, inside the house? The water supply, where it will come in.
The water supply will be inside the thermal envelope, yes. So if you want to put an external tap on, you're going to have to just drill a hole through your building fabric. And all I would say is it's a passive house, so could you please put a grommet on it so you don't get too much air leakage? It's not disastrous, to be honest. I mean, people do fret about air tightness. We don't want more holes than we need. So, just be careful. But it's something that is completely down to you to organise. There is no responsibility left for any of the people that were involved in the build contract to deal with your alterations, extensions or anything else you want to do, other than making sure that you've got all the information you need to be able to do it properly.
Just before we finish up, there's one more thing that I've thought of, and that's the upstairs floorboards. And I had this vision of being able to leave my bedroom quietly and head downstairs. And I do notice it creaks a little bit. Is this something that could be resolved, or again, is this something to be left with, just this is how the house has been built? I remember I was here when they put it in as well, but I think there's just some sort of foam bit underneath, and it wasn't.
So we talked earlier, didn't we, about the natural materials and their likelihood to shrink and move and expand depending upon moisture content, temperature, etc. And that's what you're experiencing. This particular floor, as you say, might have a foam strip in order to try to absorb some movement and prevent that from happening. I don't know of any floor that doesn't have a little bit of movement over time, and it will perhaps close up and open up again during the seasons. So very, very difficult to actually rule out. Again, clients, they like natural materials. They like natural timber, for example. They like timber floors. Probably the bane of my life are natural timber floors. Probably you find a lot of architects would say the same, because how do you control the movement, and how do you make sure that the heating doesn't affect them, etc. if I had my way, nobody would ever put one down, but there we go.
So when you have a carpet, is it the carpet that's absorbing the sound?
If you put a carpet over a timber floor, yes, that would, it would absorb the sound and obviously prevent a little bit of movement in the timber, wouldn't it? Because it would absorb the impact. And obviously carpets on other types of floors, then the other type of floor isn't moving anyway. You've got two pieces of timber, obviously, in your floor upstairs, because we put a chipboard floor down as a base, and then you've had a rather nice oak floor laid on top of that. So the potential for movement on either of those two never goes away. So it may be the underlying chipboard, although we do a lot of work now to glue and fill those joints and screw the boards down properly to try to prevent that, because that was a known problem. We used to nail chipboard flooring down and they always creaked, but we don't do that now. And then you've got your engineered floor on top of that. So.
What would be your choice then for flooring material if you're doing it yourself?
I carpet everywhere in my house.
Right, so you're still a carpet. Because, I mean, that's not very environmentally friendly. You have to replace it as well. I do... Well, I quite like having a hard floor, but every so often when I go and visit someone with a carpet, it's just that sponginess on your feet. That's perhaps the nicest thing about it.
Yeah, well, of course, there are two people who live in my house, so the environmental friendly aspect of it comes into things. But at the end of the day, like the rest of us, we do what we're told.
Fair enough. Well, I just want to say another big thank you to you. It's been fantastic. We definitely chose the right firm to work with on this project, and it has been a pleasure. And, I'm envisaging here that when you're retired, I will leave you in peace. So just a big thank you.
Well, it's very kind of you to say. You don't need to leave me in peace. I'm naturally interested, obviously, in all the work that we've done, particularly the passive house projects that we've done. I'm very proud of all the passive house projects that we've done, and yours in particular, I think, has come out really well, particularly given some of the constraints we had at the start of the project. So I hope we stay in touch. I still follow you on Twitter. I still follow all your little podcasts. So I'm sure we'll stay in touch.
Chris, thank you.
Thank you.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session. You'll find them at houseplanninghelp.com/269. You can review the key points again. We've got a few photos of the various things that we've talked about, some of the defects, the snagging, the windows. Have a look at those close up, and oh my goodness, that was a mammoth job to replace the windows. Quite interesting to watch the process to see what they have to do to them to put the new glass in. If you have a comment or you'd like to ask a question, then you can head to the bottom of the show notes. There's a place to type away there. Links to Chris on Twitter, houseplanninghelp.com/269. Are you at the beginning of your journey? I'm perhaps all too guilty of assuming you've been with me this entire 7-year journey and you've watched all the videos on the YouTube channel and you're a member of the Hub and everything else. But if this is day one for you, then maybe you're just asking a question of what exactly is an ecological house? A lot of people don't like the term eco-home, but maybe that's the term that you're using. What is an eco-home? Well, I want to take you through our free Eco Design 101 course that we put together to try and explain some of the basics, those first steps, the important things to bear in mind. Because when you're building a house, there's lots of things to think about. So just focus on that. If you want to go through that course, you can head to houseplanninghelp.com/tips. That's it for another week. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.